Well, let me first of all explain that sometimes you're given a job at last minute and you've got to prepare for it. When you're sometimes walking into question time, you get a bit of paper and say, ask these questions. But anyway, look, I want to thank you for the invitation, and I want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal peoples on whose lands we're all gathered, and acknowledge their leaders, past, present, and those that are carrying the burdens of today. And I acknowledge here today also the distinguished visitors, any of my parliamentary colleagues that are here, and many of the Labor luminaries who are attending this conference this weekend. I think you have the presence of the Prime Minister sometime tomorrow. I thank the Chifley Research Centre for the opportunity to talk to you today. And Ben Chifley was halfway through his 4.5 years as Prime Ministership when I was born 75 years ago on the other side of the continent in Broome, Western Australia. 12 months before he became Prime Minister, Chifley, as Treasurer under Prime Minister John Curtin, was one of the architects of the post-war Reconstruction and Democratic Rights referendum that was put to the people in August 1944. The so-called 14 Powers referendum sought to give the federal government a 5-year licence to legislate on a range of health, welfare, economic and infrastructure matters. That's a bit I can read the paper now. And here's a little unknown fact, I think, or not well known amongst the thin ranks of those who know the history of our Constitution. Point number 14, and last on the list of the 1944 referendum wish list, was that the Commonwealth to have power to legislate for the people of the Aboriginal race. Interesting. It seemed that the Labor government tackled the Aboriginal clause, or tacked it on, onto its Reconstruction agenda at the behest of the Association for the Protection of Native Races, whose president was the clergyman and anthropologist A.P. Elkin, a renowned assimilationist. But pre-world world agitation by Aboriginal leaders like the Yorta Yorta famous individual, Mr. William Cooper, would also have played into the government's wish to legislate for Aboriginal people. I'm a great admirer of Cooper, who in 1937 famously presented the Prime Minister Joseph Lyons with a petition to be forwarded to the King George V, praying for Aboriginal representation in the Commonwealth Parliament, 1937. Lyons made a pretence of considering the petition, but he didn't forward it to the King. 1901, 1937, 1967, the referendum. So this is before the referendum. Australia's international standing post-war was no doubt another factor which moved the Labor government to be seen to take some responsibility for First Nations peoples. Not that that language would have been used back then. But still, and there's still some nervousness today about referring to First Nations in this country. The Victorian Labor MP, Leslie Helen, was publicity director for the 1944 referendum, and he, for one, was mindful of our international reputation. And he said, after the war, Australia may have other dark-skinned people under its mandate or control, and unless the Aborigines are properly cared for, this country would be subject to criticism levelled at Hitler and his followers when they oppressed the minority populations under their control. End of quote. In spite of Helen's publicity skills, the referendum was lost. It did gain a majority of votes in 2 states, South Australia and Western Australia, surprisingly my home state. But nationally, it won only 45.99% approval. And as you know, a double majority is required to get successful outcomes in referenda. No doubt the majority voters were put off by the multiplicity of clauses which the government was seeking to win approval for under the umbrella of just one omnibus question. Chifley became Prime Minister a year after the referendum, but he was never inclined to revisit the idea that the Commonwealth should be able to legislate for Aboriginal people. In the words of his biographer, David Day, I quote, "He seemed content to let responsibility for their welfare rest largely with the states whose treatment of Aborigines varied from indifference to atrocious." End of quote. The status quo would prevail. That is, section 51(26) of the Constitution remained. That section then said, this is back at the time before its change in 67, but it said then, "The Parliament shall have power to make laws with respect to the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state, for whom it is necessary to make special laws." So the Commonwealth couldn't make laws for Aboriginal people under the original drafting of the Constitution, section 51(26). So from the first days of Federation, the states had free rein to rule over us, make laws and control our lives. Not having us on their books, except in the Northern Territory, gave the Commonwealth Government the excuse to pretend to ignore us. Any blame for bad treatment lay with the states. There was still land aplenty to be grabbed at the start of the Federation. Killing of Aboriginal people would continue for at least the first 3 centuries in the life of the new country without anyone being accountable. Only a couple of months ago, I was invited to write an endorsement of a new non-fiction book about a massacre of Aboriginal people in the Kimberley in 1926. Kate Audie is the author, and her book is called Uluru of the Underworld. Kate was my legal officer when I was a commissioner on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. In her account, police officers and white civilians murdered at least 20 people from the Umbulgari area, Forest River. The country I know well, it's near Wyndham, it's on the other side of the bay. Umbulgari, a mission settlement, was demolished by the Western Australian Government only a few years ago. Bernard O'Leary was a returned World War I light horseman, and Audie puts him at the centre of the killing with 2 police officers. The official response by the Western Australian Government was calculated to bury the truth and deny justice to Aboriginal people. A Royal Commission in 1927 was compromised by missing witnesses. A subsequent criminal trial of the 2 police officers went nowhere. Even in the Northern Territory, where the Commonwealth Government did have constitutional control, uniformed killers ran amok and nothing adverse ever happened against them. In 1928, The Constance massacre in Central Australia, for example, was scandalously covered up. After the killing of one white man, a fellow called Fred Brooks, revenge raids led by police officially left 31 Aboriginal men, women and children dead. The death toll was certainly much higher than that. The raid was led by Constable George Murray, also a former World War I light horseman. And he happened to be an acquaintance of Bernard O'Leary, the fellow involved in the Forest River massacre, who'd crossed the border from Western Australia to join his mate in the killings around Tennant Creek and north of Alice Springs, the Constance massacre. A sham board of inquiry appointed by the Commonwealth Government found that the Constance killings were justified on the grounds of self-defence. Now, I dwell on these horror stories not just because of their relative recent nature, but because they represent the unfinished business that the Uluru Statement from the Heart seeks to address. And we're 10 years out from the 100th year anniversary of these matters. So by that stage, you'll be in the middle of truth-telling and treaty-making. And stories like this will be hopefully in the public domain and people grappling with the truth of them. The country thought it was on the road to repair when it voted in a majority at the 1967 referendum. And they voted for the Commonwealth to be able to make special laws for Aboriginal people. They also amended that section of the Constitution, which meant we could be counted in the reckoning of the numbers. And for the record, that 67 referendum, it was 23 years after the doomed 1944 referendum promoted by the Curtin government. So this tension point between federalising Aboriginal affairs or the control of Aboriginal peoples by the jurisdictions found some accommodation in 1967 with the removal of parts of that power in 68 and 51-26. At that time, there was a lot of euphoria when more than the 90% vote said yes to the amendment to the Constitution. And I often wondered whether that was because it wasn't a new provision in the Constitution, a new chapter in the Constitution, or because the amendment sat squarely in its original racist intent, the racist intent underpinning 51-26. We haven't got time to go into that. The smart people amongst you will know what I'm talking about. But that amendment, so widely celebrated, would prove to be something of a Trojan horse. I was in my final years at secondary school down in Victoria, as mentioned, captain of the school, captain of the footy team, when the 67 referendum was held. I was 18, but I couldn't vote because the voting age back then was 21 years of age. But I do remember that the general presumption at the time was that things might improve for us Aboriginal people because the Commonwealth was taking hold of policy and legislation and delivering the practical outcomes in the social spaces. Very hopeful period of time. We all thought the constitutional amendment and the so-called race power would authorise the Commonwealth to enact only beneficial laws affecting us. And there's a whole history if you look at the attitudes of both sides of politics about not discriminating against Aboriginal people. It's a history the current opposition ought to go back and have a look at. And we took heart from the High Court Tasmanian Dam case in 1983, when the then Justice Gerard Brennan, who later became the Chief Justice, said the race power was, and I quote, an affirmation of the will of the Australian people that the odious policies of oppression and neglect of Aboriginal citizens were to be at an end, and that the primary object of the power is beneficial, unquote. That's what Jed Brennan said. Further, Justice Brennan said back in 1984, and I quote again, the passing of the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975 manifested the Parliament's intention that the race power would only be for the purpose of discriminatorily conferring benefits upon the people of a race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. The race power, for example, entitled the Commonwealth Parliament to pass the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act in 1984 and the Native Title Act in 1993. None of us expected that power could be used against us. How misplaced was that? The High Court blew away that expectation in 1998 when it upheld the validity of the Howard government's Hindmarsh Bridge Act. As the dissenting judge, Michael Kirby, wrote, and I quote, the Act was designed, in effect, to terminate the pursuit by Aboriginal traditional owners of their rights under the Heritage Protection Act and to prevent any further such application. End of quote. Mr. Howard's contribution to the world. And so it was that the Howard government went on to use the 1967 amendment to licence a welter of laws to sustain its infamous Northern Territory intervention in 2007. I've said it elsewhere before. It was to the discredit of the Labor opposition that it backed the intervention, even though it was facing an imminent federal election and was not wanting to be seen to oppose the Malbrough rhetoric about protecting Aboriginal children. If ever there needed to be a First Nations voice to the Parliament, that was the time. And it's currently the time because of the way the current Leader of the Opposition carries on in relation to the Aboriginal people of the Northern Territory and seeking a Royal Commission into so-called sexual abuse of children. Obviously, they're very sensitive and very challenging causes, but we're in a different climate today. The Howard government, of course, got rid of ATSIC a couple of years earlier, also with Labor support, because I must note that. Because it had fallen out of favour with the government, ATSIC was disbanded, just as previous representative national bodies had been got rid of. The National Aboriginal Conference in 1985, the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee before that in 1977. Howard himself had forever opposed the creation of ATSIC, and the coalition argument in 1989, when the ATSIC legislation was introduced, bears close resemblance to the arguments today from some of the coalition who oppose the principle that a voice should be embedded in the Constitution. At least for the meantime, Opposition Leader Mr Dutton, while niggling away about the need for more detail about the voice, has been prepared to engage with the referendum working group set up by the Albanese government. That body's been assembled to advise us, the government, on implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart, especially the up-and-coming referendum as the first stage of the Albanese government and commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. The next steps, of course, are the Makarrata Commission, which entails truth-telling and treaty-making. The working group comprises around 20 First Nations leaders, and they have been advised by some of the best constitutional lawyers in the country. Not by the government lawyers, but by lawyers that are advising them on matters that are of concern to them in relation to the provision that's proposed by the Prime Minister at the Gama speech. The working group last met again only 2 days ago when Mr Dutton joined for a while. The working group took time to brief him on Thursday about the many turns of events which culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart in May 2017, which was the culmination of an exhaustive round of constitutional consultations with First Nations peoples across Australia. They're referred to as dialogues, but they are constitutional consultations which culminated at Uluru. So the call for a constitutional convention is well gone. Mr Leeser should take note. A dozen regional constitutional dialogues preceded the convention at Uluru, and hundreds of delegates to those dialogues were carefully chosen by their constituencies. 60% came from traditional owner groups, 20% from community organisations, and the remaining 20% were key individuals. When the journey to recognition was launched many years ago, before these regional dialogues and the convention at Uluru, you can go back to 1928, the Day of Mourning in Sydney, of course, very important period in our history. Out of that was the petition to Lions to have a representative in the Parliament to look after the Aboriginal people. As the working group informed Mr Dutton, we've had 7 processes, 10 reports since 2011. And I think it's worth reminding you all today about how torturous that journey has been. In November 2010, Prime Minister Julia Gillard established an expert panel to consult on options for a constitutional amendment recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to be put to a referendum. I co-chaired that expert panel with the esteemed Melbourne lawyer, Mr Mark Liebler, and we reported to the government in January 2012. In February 2013, the Parliament passed the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples Recognition Act, which was sent off for consideration to a joint select committee. The committee was chaired by Ken White, who became Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in the coalition government, and Senator Nova Paris from the Northern Territory. And they produced 3 reports: an interim report in July 2014, a progress report in October 2014, and its final report in June 2015. There's a lot of detail around. As well, in September 2014, there was a report of a review panel which was tasked with assessing levels of public awareness and support for amending the Constitution. And who was on that? John Anderson, who was also apparently an opponent now of The Voice, but he was the chair of that review panel. I, by that stage, was back in the fray in December 2015, when Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Opposition Leader Bill Shorten appointed me to co-chair the Referendum Council, whose job was to advise on progress and the next steps towards a successful referendum. I unfortunately had to resign from that council in March 2016, and that was before the dialogues began. And I resigned because I'd been invited by Bill Shorten to fill a casual vacancy in the Senate for Western Australia, and that's how I became a senator. I was there a week and they called a double dissolution. I had to go back and get re-elected. That was the impact of my presence. After the Uluru statement was settled in May 2017 and the Referendum Council reported a month later, I co-chaired with Mr Julian Lisa from the other side the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Reform, and we submitted our final report in November 2018. And this, of course, was when Malcolm Turnbull was kicking the can down the road. And it was a stopgap measure, otherwise this whole thing would have gone off the political agenda, I can assure you. This was the best we could manage to stop the issue of a voice to Parliament from being lost under false assertions that it would be a third chamber of Parliament. Finally, after the election of the Morrison government, Professor Marcia Langton and Tom Calma in July 2021 produced their final report on a co-design process to establish a voice. Although that government has skewed the fundamental request from Uluru that the voice should be embedded in the Constitution. That committee was prohibited from considering that issue by that particular government. The Labor government, led by Mr Albanese, has had no such qualms, been committed from day one to this process. And as you all know, we're committed to implementing in full the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and we'll be holding a referendum before the end of this calendar year, seeking to embed the voice in our Constitution. It's a principle matter, this. Constitutions are about principle, not about detail. Parliament deals with detail. We do that every day of the week. That's why we have oppositions and arguments and committees and reviews, etc. That's where detail is done. Referendums decide on principles to go in the Constitution upon which we rely, or governments rely, to make laws. And while there's much focus in our work since coming to office just 8 months ago has been on the voice aspect, we have not passed over the other important elements of the Uluru Statement, treaty and truth-telling. For instance, in our last budget, we committed $5.8 million towards establishing the Makarrata Commission. These things aren't easy, they take time. There are all sorts of examples around the world, and we've got to glean what is the best way for us to proceed, and obviously in consultation with the First Nations peoples themselves and the broader Australian public. We are in for a very exciting time beyond the referendum, let me assure you. So you're on the start of a very, very important journey. If you're thinking of relaxing, retiring, put that to one side. The journey's about to begin. We'll be in a position to say more about the progress of these matters later in the year. In my first public engagement as Special Envoy for Reconciliation and the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, I spoke to Reconciliation Australia at its national conference in June last year, and I pledged then that I would not be attacking those who would be arguing against the voice. In the end, they're entitled to their opinions, as wrong-headed as they might be. I've held to that pledge, but let me tell you, with so much nonsense and mischief being peddled out there, there have been times when it's been hard to hold my tongue. Having said that, there are some myths and misinformation which I must put to rest. The provision, that's the technical term for the amendment that you want to put in the Constitution, the provision. The provision proposed by the Prime Minister at the Gama Festival last year will give recognition to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution and give them a right to be consulted by the Parliament and the government when it comes to make laws or policies about them. That's all it does. Doesn't do any other tricky things. That's what it does. The Parliament will remain supreme and will be unencumbered in its law-making functions. It'll just churn along as it does every other time and bore us or make us happy or do something else about us, to us. The voice will be chosen by Aboriginal peoples based on the wishes of their local communities. These are principles agreed by the working group. It will be representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. It'll be empowering, community-led, inclusive, respectful, culturally informed, gender balanced, and will include youth. Importantly, it will be accountable and transparent, and it will work alongside existing organisations and traditional structures. As I said, these principles were agreed, along with others, that it won't have a program function, it won't be administering monies, and it won't have any kind of veto role or capacity to stop government doing what the government does, or the Parliament. At the meeting last Thursday, the working group decided that they would have a look at the already publicised design principles and see whether they wish to add further substance to that. And that's work I'll be doing next week with them to deal with the hard work done by the Langton-Calma review, the work done by Professor Davis and others, and the report that I mentioned before that Julian, Lisa and myself had undertaken. So people are not unresponsive to the question of detail. They just think it's a bit crazy asking what colour shirt you're going to wear tomorrow. And to that end, I'll be chairing this small subcommittee of the working group to progress those matters, and we'll report back to the working group at a meeting in a couple of weeks' time. And there are some out there who, as I say, are pressing for more detail, and they'll never get enough. But the process, our political process, is in the Parliament, and that's where the detail is always settled and proposed. So don't be distracted by the call for detail. And the Parliament will deal with that in the post-referendum period. We're expecting that the working group, having considered the expert legal advice that they've sought, will give its final recommendations on the referendum question. There's certain ways the question has to be asked in the referendum, and the constitutional amendment, the provision, within the next couple of months. We'll then be on track to introduce the Constitutional Alterations Bill in the Parliament around March. So these things are going to move relatively quickly. Even though we're talking about it at the end of the year, there's a whole lot of things that have to be done in the early part of the year. As you know, the referendum has got to be put within 6 months of the passage of these legislations. The Parliament will then obviously debate. There'll be a committee, and the committee there'll be time for everyone to have a look at what's being proposed, to make proposals, to put suggestions, etc., etc. And that committee will report after a reasonable time of its activity, and then the bill will come back to the House for consideration. And once passed, and we hope that the parties on the crossbenches see the wisdom of not just being a Labor Party thing, but a thing for the nation. This is for us as a nation. After 250 years, we've got the courage as the Australian people to look at the legacy of our history, our colonial settler history, where we had this terrible thing called terra nullius that said there was no one here. No one's here. We dealt with that in the Mabo judgment, or the courts did, and now in the political sense, we are, as the nation in whom the sovereignty resides, and you are looking at the relationship question with the First Peoples of this country and saying, we hope in the referendum, we support the idea that there should be a voice for the First Nations peoples, and that voice should be exercised when the Parliament or the government is wanting to pass laws that are going to affect them. That's all we're saying in this process. But these things, this referendum is really not about the politicians. In fact, the Uluru Statements ask that it be kept away from us and put in your hands, the people. We're just the catalyst, we're the agency. You've got to get laws passed, you need to get them passed through a parliament. That's what we are. And we're a party committed to doing this, thankfully. As I said, the invitation from Uluru was to the people of Australia. And the people of Australia are the only people who can successfully return a referendum question that says yes or no. And I can assure you, if we do pass this referendum, we'll be a better country. There'll be no doubt about that. And it just seems so obvious to me that after all the years and the goodwill and the frustrations with our goodwill at different times, why shouldn't the First Nations people secure a formal structure through which it can provide advice to the Parliament and the government on matters which affect them? There's absolutely nothing threatening about that. And why shouldn't this vehicle, the voice that provides advice to Parliament and government, be protected in our founding document? If you go back to the rhetoric that underpinned the 1901 Constitution, we were a dying race. And so they didn't worry too much about us. They thought we were going to disappear. Didn't have much foresight, did they? In doing this, if we're able to come to a yes vote as a nation in support of the proposition that's put to us, we'll be respecting and recognising the First Nations by doing this. It'll be an act of our recognition, our reciprocation to the Uluru Statement from the heart. And at least the First Nations peoples will be recognised by us, the Australian people. And it will obviously be a moment of great joy, I would hope, for all of us. And to reflect on something that Gough Whitlam said, we will no longer remain diminished as a nation. We can stand with pride if we do this. A successful referendum will signal a new and unified era in this great country of ours. And what a message that will send out, not only to us in this country, but to the people that neighbour us, to the international community. And it will serve us very well, as we are moving into a different era internationally, as you all follow. Who would have thought a foreign minister from Australia would go to the Poms and say, you better start telling the truth to people? And we all know that governments of whatever persuasions have failed the Aboriginal people. and that international agencies are constantly taking note of these failures, and they will again in the near future. It's time for us to shift this axis of the relationship we've had to date. It's time for us to do that. It continues to appall me that statistics around the entrenched poverty, incarceration rates, child removals, that they continue to blight First Nations communities, especially in remote communities. And I live in the Kimberleys. I don't live in Perth, I live in the Kimberleys. I'm one of the politicians that actually lives the furthest point away from Canberra. I'm closer to Jakarta and Timor than most of these other pollies. But we are all capable of doing things better, and we must do things better. And a permanent voice with a singular focus on matters that matter to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples will help achieve these better outcomes. I'm getting to the end, so you'll be asked a question soon. I've been on a mission of reconciliation for decades now. Some people often ask me, why have you been optimistic or keep doing it? I often wonder that myself, but anyway. As I said at the start of this address, I turned 75 a few weeks ago. This makes me a very, very old man in Aboriginal society. And I don't say this to be emotional about it, but there won't be another opportunity like this. There won't be another invitation like this from the Aboriginal people that's come from Uluru. Certainly not in my lifetime. I hope that Australians will respond generously to this very simple request as the first step in us fixing things. As I said, the other components of the Uluru Statement will follow under this Albanese government, the Makarrata Commission, the truth-telling and the treaty-making. They are going to be pursued by the Albanese government, if not in this term of its period, hopefully in this next term. But can I thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to take on any questions.
Do you want to grab a seat?
Yeah.
Patrick, thank you for a tremendous presentation. I think the reaction demonstrates the force that it's had. You dealt with the long path and the fact that it's been a twisting and long path, and you dealt with the detail. But I thought most importantly what you pointed out is this is no token endeavour. This is a very real thing, particularly when you're talking about Hindmarsh Island and what occurred after that in the courts, which demonstrated that the 67 powers are very much a two-way street, and then to which you add that the history of previous Indigenous representative bodies being dismantled. Essentially, when people become uncomfortable with voices, they can turn voices off. Not just not listen to voices, but actually turn them off. And to my mind, that's the power of what you had to say today. You illustrated why this very simple proposition is so critical, because it would ensure that some of the difficulties that emerge from court decisions about the 1967 changes and some of the clear ongoing risks where people who are uncomfortable with voices can turn them off would be in large part dealt with a successful referendum like this. Anyway, enough from me. We have a question in the centre here. If we can have a microphone, and then we'll go to the front after that. Just wait for a microphone to come.
Look, thanks for all of that. I think it is inevitable that people like you and other Aboriginal voices will have to bear the major role in moving towards the referendum. But I have a long background. I'm now a retired public servant and unionist, and I have time. What I want to know is, are there any bodies that would take volunteer assistance from people like me in the lead up to the referendum to kind of sort of back up? Canberra is easy to get to, where we don't count as a state, and anyway they'll probably vote for it here anyway, but there's great chunks of the rest of Australia that we need to persuade of the, well, simplicity, the need and the value of this particular referendum. And I'd welcome, if there is anywhere I can volunteer, I'd be very happy to do it.
Can I thank you for your generosity? The union movement itself is going to have a program. Sally McManus and others have already working on how the union movement can participate constructively, so I'd go back in the first instance to the union you did belong to and see what they're intending to do and where they're intending to be. There'll be a week of action being launched, I think, off the top of my head, I haven't got a bit of paper in front of me, but I think it's the 18th or 19th of February. There'll be a week of action, and then there'll be a whole range of bodies that are at the forefront from the Indigenous side, from the First Nation side, but there are many, many other groups that will emerge in this process. You saw the Prime Minister sign a statement of intent, commitment with the chief ministers or the leading premiers the other day, which is a really good sign that the leaders in the states and the territories have already signed up to work collaboratively with the Commonwealth in relation to this. So look for the signs of where the movement's happening. The loud voices that protest against it, they'll swan around, and social media will have a whole host of people. But let's keep our eyes on the prize. Work with the known people you know, and there'll be groups here in Canberra that will no doubt emerge more obviously once this week of action gets launched.
Activate the local branches.
Yeah, get your branches going. That's how you build a tree.
So we'll deal with the gentleman here and then...
Yes, I'm on Neil Halliday, retired psych nurse. As you know, Noel Pearson supports Professor Bill Mitchell's concept of a job guarantee. You're aware of that, aren't you?
No.
Oh.
But that's all right. I'm not aware of many things.
Okay. So actually we've got Professor Shireen Morris, who I heard for the first time on Radio National a couple of days ago, speaking about this. It's a remarkable lecture she gave, so she'll tell us a lot, I think. Now, so in 1977, which party introduced the CDEP, the Community Development Employment Program for Aboriginal communities? Now, the words say it all: community development via employment programs. Now, that was introduced and it was cancelled in 2004 owing to, I believe, free market ideologues who believe that only work in the private sector free market contribute to the nation's productivity. Therefore, many of these CDEP programs were in fact, they believe, not contributing to the nation's productivity, which I think is total nonsense. We'll leave that aside. What I would like from your experience, I believe that the CDEP reduced crime and reduced alcoholism through the sheer experience of being independent, not being on welfare, not being on sit-down money, for what it did for individuals, that they're gainfully employed and being part of a functional community, which is what any functional community must have, gainful employment. Unfortunately, in our modern money economy, everybody has to be gainfully employed or you're shoved off onto the dole. Now, so I would like, what I want from you now is your impression of the CDEP. Was it successful in the communities? And I'm hoping you'll say yes and can back me up on that.
All right. Well, you might recall that when the Gringy people walked off Wave Hill, which was run by Lord Vestey, a pommy bloke, and they protested and withdrew their labour. And they sat down at Dagaragu. And out of that came this first debate about how do we recognise land rights for Aboriginal people, leases, licences, freehold, etc. So that's where that history goes to. At the same time, there was the wages case for pastoral workers in the Northern Territory, whether Aboriginal people should be paid the basic wage as stockmen. And of course that's got a legacy to it. And John Kerr was one of the council involved in that. But out of that came the sit-down process. People were just taken off stations, dumped in these little towns, and were given some kind of welfare payment, and the devastation that took place. And it was Viner and Cheney who were at the forefront of this, Liberals, who thought that there needed to be a better way to deal with this awful situation. And that's where the origins of working for the dole came. And the CDP, the Community Development Employment Program, came about, which was run and managed by Aboriginal people in the communities. And there was an add-on component to that in the savings that they made, that they could then deploy those savings for other things that were of interest or importance in those communities. Now that whole structure got gutted by the Liberal government. And they brought in a thing called CDP. And they brought in this concept of mutual obligation. If you don't work, you don't get paid. And many people couldn't even navigate the system to protest about how they were being treated. And there were no job markets out here. You've got a job market at Yuendamu or Papunya or Bulgo. And if they didn't front, they got penalised. 6 weeks, no income. A terrible thing. Even discussions I had with Fred Cheney at the time, and Fred was on the other side of politics, but a very good man. He was in tears about the poverty that was being reaped upon or brought about throughout the desert regions of Western Australia and the Northern Territory by this draconian policy that was brought in under the Liberals. Now, what we're trying to do as a Labor government under Mr Albanese is we're going back to look at, and we promised the communities that we'll reinstate programs similar to the CDEP, back in the hands of the people, real wages for people, conditions, proper conditions for people, and to look not only just at creating work, but family supports, look at community building, and hopefully enterprise opportunities, not just hoping that someone's going to parachute in. So that's a work in progress that the Minister is working her way through at the moment, and the sooner we can get that back in place, the better it will be for many of our people.
If you're comfortable, you might run through the 5 parts. Is that all right?
Yeah. Good gentleman here.
Hi, Ross Kirkman from Hobart.
Yeah.
This is really about politics. Referenda generally, I'm here.
Sorry.
Referenda generally don't do so well when the opposition opposes them. And currently we've got Julian Leeser saying things pretty much the same as Dutton. What game do you think Julian Leeser is playing, and where do you think the opposition will end up?
Look, I think there's probably a number of views on whether today in this world where we've got social media and all of these other means of communication, whether the bipartisanship is as significant as it had been. I'm not dismissing it. I think it's very important that there is bipartisanship for the unity of the nation, that we as Australians can come together around a relatively simple proposition, but complex for some, and find our ways through that and support it. Because if we've got unanimity amongst ourselves as Australians across the political divides, it's going to augur a lot better for our nation. But if there's one mob that's standing out and saying, no, we don't like this, well, they're always going to be the rump going forward, conniving and trying to undermine any good thing that we try to do in the future. But anyway, where they're at, I don't sit in their party room, thankfully. But I think it's a very difficult room for Mr. Dutton to navigate. Because you've got people like Julian who say they've been supporters of this. He's finding it difficult now because, I'm not sure it's because he's unintelligent. He's a lawyer, he's a shadow attorney. He knows what a provision is in the Constitution. He knows that a referendum is about principle, and he knows detail is about parliamentary process. So it's not about what's being said out there in the public ether. It's about something internal within their party that's causing them to either stay in oblivion. We've seen the response of the Teals in most of those seats. So they've got some political internal, I don't know, and I'm not interested in trying to solve them for them. But I would hope that the goodwill which Mr. Dutton seemed to underpin his interaction with the working group last week is carried forward. He's prepared to meet with them again, and I hope that that's a bit more of an exchange, and he can come away from that assured that there's nothing hidden here. This is not an Albanese magic trick. This is a request from the Aboriginal people to which the Albanese government is responding, and we'll do the best we can for that, of course. And Mr. Albanese has invited him to participate in these processes. The working groups invited him to come and talk to them. So there's no one trying to hide in a corner and say, we're going to reveal this on the big day. So I really can't fathom why it's political machinations within his party, I would think. Any Australian who has bothered to read anything about the nature of the First Nations peoples in this country, the overturning of Mabo, the debates we went through in Mabo, the Native Title Act and the trauma we went through with all of that, surely have got to understand that the current incarceration rates, kids being out of home, all of those things, we need to come together to work on these things. We don't, after 67 there was this bipartisanship of the parties to try and get positive, constructive social policies to respond to all of the matters that we're still trying to respond to. Now, that's why I think bipartisanship's important. But I have far more trust in the Australian people overall to see the merit of what it's being aimed at here and the principle that they want to see enshrined in our Constitution.
Okay, I'm going to have to keep it at 3 more questions, unfortunately, just because of our time constraints. So first here, and then we've got 2 in the middle of the room, but the gentleman just to the right here.
Thank you. Thank you for your address, Senator. My name's Matt. I'm a Wadi man from the Yuin Nation. I just wanted to ask you a question. Do you think that there's a larger narrative the Albanese government could start to weave in regards to maturity of a nation in order to get across... Sorry, I'll start again. I see it like this. The Albanese government wishes to embark upon the voice and maybe treaty making and maybe truth telling and maybe a republic, do you think that these ideas can be congealed in a way to say that we are attempting to become our own nation of our own self, of our own cultural identity? And because treaties only happen really once with a settler state, what should we look out for the long-term view for the voice if it is to be embedded into the Constitution? Because it will be something that may be in the Australian framework for centuries after treaty is made.
I'm not. There's a lot of complexity in what you raise, but and I don't know what the future will pan out to be. But I do have hope that we are not only on the right path, but that we are committed to dealing justly with the First Nations peoples in a way that has never been the situation in the past. That is through a voice in the Constitution which can advise the government or put advice to the government on what they think about anything, treaties, etc. There may be more than one treaty. There may be a number of treaties. Those discussions are yet to be held. People are respectful of the individual Aboriginal nation states and the right of people to speak for themselves.
What do you think of, sorry to interrupt you, what do you think of Indigenous people using the European construction of the nation state in order to gain some modicum of respect with the settler society?
Well, I don't think it's us gaining respect with the settler society. I think
maybe a hearing.
I think it's the nation finally maturing in its relationship with the Aboriginal people, and in that we all gain, and we all gain respect. We haven't had a really good history on either side of this.
Gentlemen, if you just...
Senator Dodson, I have lived with your first questioner today for 40 years, so this is going to be a kind of dinner table conversation. I have a campaign idea, and it would just be a little bit of the campaign, and I call it One Other Person. As this issue reaches out into society in the coming months, people are going to start talking about it in their workplaces, in their families. And I would like to suggest that to each person who does support the voice, identifies one other person who are unsure or hostile or has different views to ourselves. And we, each of us, focus on one other person. Now, I've got an idea of, in our community, who that would be. I'll talk to Jennifer about that privately. But there will be a load of people asking Jennifer's question, what can I do? And this would be one thing that everybody could do, would be to find that person who's struggling with the issue and make sure you have a continuing conversation with them to get the idea across. And it would be nice if the official campaign sort of said, here, find one other person, here's a kit, covers the issues, here's some ideas about how to talk about it in a non-hostile way, because let's face it, often you meet a person in society who says, I don't agree with this, I think this idea is stupid, and your immediate response is, no, it isn't, and you have a row. You don't change a person's mind in a row. You have to get them, first of all, to feel listened to by you, and then drawn out so that they feel they've been heard, and then you can start to engage and say, I've heard you, Now, this is what I have to say about that issue. So that's just an idea.
Well,
It was
have
a
a question, we'll put
it
it
was a
succinctly.
statement.
yeah, okay. And just the last question was...
My question follows on the previous comment, because I did try to find some detail, and you Google and you get about 300 things come up. I eventually did find the 2017 report, and I think it's on page 17. But unlike Karen at Bunnings, I regret I don't have it in my handbag at the moment, but there was a terrific chart that set out the principles, what the voice would do, what it wouldn't do, the regional structure and so on. And I hope someone is going to set up a web page called thevoice.gov.au where we have these key documents. Not the 289 pages, you can have them, but it was a terrific graphic. But do please print it on black and white, not white on a coloured background that old people can't read. The Uluru Statement and so on, just a few key documents, and then every school, every library in the country can have them, so that when you want to have your discussion, you do a Karen, even in Bunnings, you bring it out and you can say, well, no, it's not going to be spending, it's not going to be running programs, and this is how it's going to work. All the detail is absolutely there, as you've said, although various people don't know it. But I think we run the risk of everybody saying all different kinds of things, and then Peter Credlin will say, oh, that's not what you said yesterday. So I'd like to see a website for The Voice, and with leading people like yourself with some comment on that. Thanks.
Can I just make a comment on on that? The government has adopted a position, and I should have mentioned this earlier in my discussion. We've got before the Act to change the Constitution, the Constitutional Amendment Act, we'll be introducing in the next couple of weeks an Act to deal with the referendum machinery provisions. And there's a committee that's been out and about and people are giving submissions. And that's about the process, procedures, to try and bring them into the way we deal with modern voting, because it's very archaic, that some of those requirements. For instance, the pamphlet. Anyone under 40 would know this. Most people, no, anyone over 40 will know this. Those under it won't, because that's about the time we had the last referendum. There's this pamphlet that usually sets out an argument for and against, and it has to be posted to every postbox in Australia. That's the current rules, and it would cost the government $17 million. We're not going to spend that money on that. And so this machinery provision is to deal with things like that, practical things. And you'll see in the next, the committee reports on the 10th of February, so maybe towards the second week of the parliamentary sitting, you'll hear about the machinery provision, the Referendum Machinery Provision Act. That's the mechanics of it. Part of that goes to the government not supporting a campaign one way or another. It's not going to put money into the campaign one way or another. But what it will do is provide some money to two organisations who escape my mind, I'm sorry about this, who will produce the kind of information that you're asking about. And there'll be an improved website also in production. So they'll be talking about not the merits of the voice, but what it is, what its functions are going to be, etc., and not advocating one way or another. So they'll just provide you with information about referenda, double majority, voting, etc., etc. Now, the Australian Electoral Commission is also involved, so you can go to them for the technicalities of the voting procedures. The vote on the referendum is potentially in the latter part of this year, September through to December. The Prime Minister will make a decision on that. So there's plenty of time to get the kind of information you're talking about. And there's time that these two key organisations they'll be made known to the public as to where you can get objective data rather than an interpretation of the data by someone like me.